Good morning, everybody. I'm Allison Aubrey of NPR News. So welcome to this delicious science of food and mood conversation. We are going to start by thinking about two foods. Raise your hands if you like milkshakes. Got milkshake lovers here. How do you feel about arugula? Oh, got a lot of arugula lovers. Okay. I am going to ask you for some participation, how you feel after you eat a milkshake versus how you feel after you eat arugula. You guys be thinking about that while I'll introduce our fine panel. So we have Dan Hann of University of Kentucky, Rachel Hers of Brown University, and Uma Naidu, a faculty member at Harvard Medical School. So after you have a milkshake, how do you feel? Tired. Indulged, okay. And when you eat arugula or something bitter like a bitter green, how do you feel? Virtuous, okay. All right, we all know that feeling of being hangry, right? Like I have 3 children, and it took me until the third to realize that when they get off the school bus, you have cheese sticks ready, right? Because a hangry child is an upset child. So we all know that the lack of food affects our mood, but there's actual science to show that your mood, your disposition, and your expectations also shape how you perceive taste. So I want to start with you, Rachel. Talk a little bit about how what we taste affects our mood and how our mood affects how we taste.
Absolutely, thank you. So first of all, as you probably are thinking about the milkshake, it has a lot of sugar, it has a lot of fat, so it's creamy, and it's giving you that sort of delicious feeling of taste, because actually we are hardwired to like sugar, salt, and fat, because they're directly linked to our survival. There's unfortunately nothing we can really do about that. And when we taste something sweet, we actually have a dopamine and serotonin release. When we have fatty foods, it releases endorphins. It's literally like a painkiller for our mood and our body. And in fact, getting that little lollipop at the doctor's office after the little shot is in fact the little sweet treat which makes the shot go down better and the pill go down better. So it is true that when we taste something sweet, when we taste something fatty, we do have a physiological response which is mood boosting. The only problem is that it is short-lived. And depending on how much you're consuming of that positive experience, you may end up at the end of it feeling either logy, because in fact too much serotonin, depending upon what the time of day is, can make you feel in fact sleepy and fatigued. And also you may have emotional feelings like guilt or other kinds of feelings that you shouldn't have done all that indulgence. So that's kind of a complex response. Now in terms of the effect of tasting something also on our mood is bitter. So bitter taste can actually make us feel more hostile. So we did a study, in fact, looking at people tasting something sweet, something neutral, and something bitter, and then they filled in a sort of a survey questionnaire about how hostile they felt. So items like, I feel offended, I feel angry, I feel sort of disgruntled and annoyed. And what we found is that after people tasted the bitter things, they scored higher on this hostility scale than after the neutral or the sweet things. And also, if they had the perception, and this is independent of what they were actually tasting, and one of the sweet things was a Hershey's Kiss, and the neutral was water. If they thought that water was kind of bitter, or the Hershey's Kiss was kind of bitter, they also felt more hostile. So it was the bitter things, which were quinine and gentian tea, which if you've ever had is super bitter. That made people more hostile. But if you thought water was bitter, that also made you more hostile. So your endogenous sense of bitterness actually makes you more hostile. Mm-hmm. Now, very positively, there's a little spin on this, if we got people to do an agreeableness scale, which is how pro-social and positive you feel towards the world, first, before answering the hostility responses, that effect went away. So the bottom line is, if we remember the better angels of our nature, then we will not get the negative impact on pro-social interactions that bitter taste might otherwise produce.
So it's a very complicated response. And it doesn't matter if there's a lot of arugula lovers in this room, you saw the hands. Does it matter if you're a habituated eater of bitter foods, and that's your pattern of eating? Like, it's healthy, chemically, do you still have that same response to bitter?
So you're bringing up something really interesting and also complex, and I heard people say virtuous. So we also understand, especially people in this room, how certain foods are good for us, and the leafy bitter greens are generally healthy. That actually is an interesting effect because we are hardwired to think bitter is bad, because most things in nature that are bitter, and bitter represents the presence of alkaloids, which are bases from a chemistry perspective, those things are toxic. So that berry that on the bush that you put in your mouth that's actually going to kill you if you eat too many of them, those are super bitter. And it's better to avoid and not make the mistake of swallowing too much of those than to go in the other direction. Nevertheless, there is the fact that those things are good for us. And so depending upon also the fact that it's in the context of food, we can do things like put salt and dressing and other kinds of things on which block bitter. And so we can make the bitterness less bitter. It's also the question of whether or not you're a super taster or a regular or non-taster, because that has an impact on the number of taste buds you have and how strongly you perceive the bitter. So real super tasters are not going to really like arugula. Well, arugula is kind of a little different because it's not super bitter, but things like endive and Brussels sprouts, and depending upon what it is, IPA beer, black coffee, that kind of stuff, super tasters are going to be like, I don't think I can do that unless I add cream, unless I add other kinds of things to mask that bitterness. So there's a built-in reaction, your own individual taste response. There's the psychological level of I'm being a good, virtuous person and doing something healthy. And there's also the context of food, making it a little bit different than if I gave you a solution of something that tastes bitter, which is really different.
So what happens in our minds, Dr. Uma, translates to our biology. Is that right? Talk a little bit more about, there was a milkshake study that found that if you thought it was a low-fat milkshake, that you metabolized it differently, right?
That's correct. So there's this really fascinating study where people were given the exact same calories in a milkshake. One group was told that it was super indulgent, and the other was told it was a healthier version. And the impact on their hunger hormones was completely different. What that showed us was that how we think about food actually impacts how we feel. Now we know that when we eat something, there is a response within our gut microbes almost immediately, but it may not impact your mental or physical well-being until a little bit later on. So things like inflammation in the gut take a while to get set up. But that mind-body connection is very powerful. I not only see it in my clinical work and research all the time, but it has been shown to directly impact the hormones in your gut. For example, we were talking about being hangry. When we are hangry, there's less glucose in the brain, there is less emotional regulation, which is why we may feel irritable. There's also an impact in motility in the gut and the hormones that are secreted. And there's this almost symphony of things like a hormone called motilin, a hormone called ghrelin, which is often called the hunger hormone. It's not one singular response. But I also like to mention a colleague of mine, Dr. Lisa Feldman-Barrett, because she actually has interpreted emotions as also having a metabolic link to the body and brain. So it's a very fascinating subject that is not just a 1:1 ratio. And I'm glad you asked the question.
Yeah, we are what we eat, and
We are.
more in very complicated ways that translate into our biology actually change our physiology.
They do.
Yeah. So Dan, I want to talk to you. You work in neuroscience. You treat patients who have lost their sense of taste or their sense of smell. Given that we tend to eat with our eyes and our nose, we sense things before we taste, the loss of smell or taste must be a big challenge for your patients.
Well, so let me answer that by asking the crowd first. How many of us have had COVID? Everybody, right? Now, how many of you lost your sense of smell and taste during COVID? Okay, a good chunk. Okay, maybe about a third of the room who's had COVID. So how many of you enjoyed that process? Okay. How many of you remember, at least transiently during that time, how miserable that process was? Yeah, it takes a lot out of you. But this is the weird thing about the human condition. When it's transient, when it's temporary, you go through it, you endure it, and after you get better, you almost forget about it. Okay. It doesn't really come back to the front of your mind. And where I come in, where my contribution lies, is the following. Now, in terms of mechanism of how all this works, between my colleagues, Dr. Uma and Dr. Rachel, I mean, they could talk about educating the room for the next semester nonstop, and you'll be better for it. Where I come in is to look at what happens when that neurobiological mechanism that we all take for granted breaks down. Inevitably, just like any other human condition, it does break down. Sometimes due to trauma, brain injuries, chemotherapy for our cancer patients. During chemotherapy, a lot of platinum-based agents are very, very neurotoxic, especially for smell and taste. And there's a whole origin story of a new science called neurogastronomy that many of us are involved with, that started because of exactly that, trying to address how to improve quality of life for patients who have either temporary or permanent damages to their smell and taste and quality of life enjoying food.
Yeah. So one of the ways your research is going is that you have talked about trying to turn off receptors that can change flavor perception. Talk a little bit about where science is leading us in terms of manipulating receptors that modulate sense of taste.
There's quite a bit. Actually, industry has been in the forefront of this for decades, if not longer. Dr. Rachel could tell us more about how a potato chip tastes different depending on the crunchy sound of the bag when it opens, and the coloring of specific types of food flavors and so on, how those modify your perception and your taste receptors and how you perceive them and enjoy the food and so on. Where I get involved is by actually directly looking at olfactory and gustatory cells and then coming up with antagonists pharmacologically so that you could actually block certain types of receptors so that it changes, for an example, bitter agents into more sweet flavors and so on. So if we could do that for modulating flavor, the idea is to have healthier and more nutritious food intake be something that we all crave, more so like chocolate or milkshake.
So you could crave arugula the way you crave a milkshake because it would taste sweet, or you would have knocked out the perception of the bitter?
Yes, by turning you into a robot.
Okay.
But
all
jokes
right.
aside.
I'm assuming we're not going there yet.
No, we're not.
Okay. So I want to switch to microbiome. I know there's a lot of interest, a lot of research in the microbiome. And 20 years ago, when it became clear just how significant a role the microbiome plays, I think there was this idea that we'd all be taking, supplements to sort of bring up one strain of good bacteria or take something else to kind of drown out a bad bacteria, and that we were going to sort of be able to just completely reform what's inside your gut microbiome. It hasn't turned out to be that easy, is that right?
Well, the research is very complex, but it's also super interesting and very hopeful.
Yeah.
We know strands of bacteria that we need to lower anxiety in the body, for example. And studies are showing things like the vagus nerve. Now, vagus nerve stimulation has been used as a modality to treat depression for some time. But actual manipulation of the vagus nerve by breathwork exercises, something that Sophie Trudeau is talking about and wrote about as well, is actually something that's very powerful, and it is something that can help someone lower their anxiety. When it comes to the actual microbiome, we need to understand, I think in the future, it will probably become an organ and be named an organ because there are trillions of microorganisms. We study the bacteria the most, which is why we talk about the bacteria, but there are 4 to 5 other types of organisms there, including viruses, protozoa, archaea, and others. But understanding what they do is critically important, and I think it's very important in mental health because the use of prebiotics, probiotics, symbiotics, and postbiotics can actually be very powerful. And the direction that I hope we go in is using food to evolve what's going on in the gut microbes so that we feel emotionally better. Or we learn that we don't necessarily have to become a robot, but learn to appreciate arugula in a different way. Arugula, by the way, is a cruciferous vegetable, so it's really super healthy and has sulforaphane in it. But at the same time, we all know that milkshake is going to be more attractive to most people.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a lot of hope, and I think that it's evolved immensely. Although Hippocrates, eons ago, knew that there was this connection between the gut and brain, and that there was a lot of disease that was manipulated through the gut.
Yes.
But this research had to follow, which is much more recent.
Yes. So what you were saying is that the hope is that, if I'm hearing you correctly, rather than each of us like taking probiotics to try to, create more of some certain good bacteria or get rid of one that's thought to be bad, that you're thinking that through the food we eat, you can manipulate the microbiome eventually?
Eventually and over time. I will point out that there was a study done with probiotic as a supplement, comparing it to selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors in depression. And
SSRIs, the main thing that people take for depression.
And for anxiety. And it found that depression improved, the scores were better with the use of the probiotic compared directly to the SSRI. So that was a supplement.
What was the probiotic? Was it like VSO or?
They basically created a supplement for the study. The issue being that I think over time, if we eat in a certain way and adapt our microbiome, it may not be initially enough to treat an acute episode of depression, but over time, I've seen in my clinical work that people do improve. So I think that it's not that we can replace an SSRI with the prebiotic, but we can start to eat in a way that supports any form of treatment that we're on.
So there are multiple strategies all aimed towards
the
reduce,
microbiome.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about this study that what happened when they took the gut microbiome of people with schizophrenia and transplanted it into mice.
So this was a really exciting study. The foundational study was actually done in 2019 and published at that time, and then there's been a burst of recent studies that have verified this information. They did a fecal microbiome transplant from an individual with active schizophrenia symptoms and transplanted it into germ-free mice. So these mice do not have a microbiome. They're raised for laboratory testing. And the mice developed symptoms of schizophrenia. And so that was very powerful, and it's been actually it's been repeated in several studies more recently in 2024 and 25. I'm super excited about that because it shows us the power of the use of that microbiome. How can we use it for even more serious conditions in mental illness, and then other conditions like depression and anxiety.
Rachel, I want you to add on to this discussion about the microbiome. In your work with students and your own research, do you feel that this is an area of interest where people are looking at interventions, thinking about them, lots of people trying out taking probiotics? Maybe just give us the landscape of the interest in microbiome and in probiotics in your world.
So first, I just want to add on to what Dr. Uma said, which is super fascinating, in that actually the gut is considered the second brain. So we have this brain and we have this brain, and this brain is communicating a lot with this brain and everywhere else in the body. And also that we have taste receptors everywhere in our body. We have taste receptors in our gut, in our intestines, in our stomach, in our lungs. If you're a man, you have them in your testicles. Now, the interesting thing is only the taste receptors in our mouth are hooked up to the taste cortex in the brain to say, this is bitter, this is sour, this is sweet. Nevertheless, the taste receptors, for example, in our gut are sensing when we're consuming carbohydrates, when we're consuming alkaloids, for example, and giving feedback to the brain on relationship to satiety, on relationship to fullness and satisfaction. So one of the things that I want to sort of underscore is listening to your body. And we have sort of lost the capacity to sort of feel how we actually feel, I think both mentally and physically. And if we take a moment to sort of feel, okay, I'm actually kind of full, or maybe I don't want to eat that more, or in fact, this is making me feel energized, I want to eat that more. If we took a moment just kind of slowing down in the food experience to recognize that, I think think we would all go a long way to being healthier in the simplest way possible. But to your question about sort of interest in the microbiome, I mean, I would just say, this, unfortunately, isn't something that I directly talk to my students about, but definitely from the point of view of popular culture and just general interest, it is huge. And what I would also say, unfortunately, is the concern about misinformation, the concern about sort of the sort of quality of the supplements that are out there, and the rigorousness of like whether or not there's any contaminants and so forth, and if there's really any science to back the use of these things, and that unfortunately in some cases they can be dangerous even depending upon what's going on. They cannot do anything in the most benign case, and for some people they can actually be helpful. And this is also, which brings up something I think is really important, which is individual differences. And we are all unique. We are, from the point of view of smell, which I love to talk about, we actually all have a unique nose. The capacity to perceive all the chemicals in the air is actually ever so slightly different for every single one of us. We also smell. Each of us actually has a unique body odor. It's as unique as your fingerprint. So the point is that from the point of view of our whole internal system and how we interact with the world around us, our physiology, our microbiome, our psychology, it is all personalized to us, and we have to also be listening to that. We can't just say, my friend, had this experience, therefore that's the same thing is going to happen to me.
I want to ask each of you how the body of literature that you are both part of creating and reading each other's work, how has the body of literature influenced your own habits? Like, how do you think in your own life about food and mood? Have you found, formulas, or is your dietary pattern influenced by your own research and what you know about food and mood?
So first I'll just say that I'm not a perfect eater, and I want everyone to feel comfortable acknowledging that to one another, because the world that I live in is not about perfect eating. It's about improving anything that we can do away from the standard American diet, which is called SAD for a reason. One of the things that became a blueprint for my work in nutritional lifestyle and metabolic psychiatry is my own experience with cancer. I was unexpectedly diagnosed when I was feeling quite healthy, and I like to tell people, when you're blessed with really great healthcare, I went from lump to IV line and within 7 days.
Wow.
And so I was actively in chemotherapy in a very short time, and it's almost as though my emotions hadn't had a chance to catch up. And what I had to really lean into was what I tell my patients every single day. I upped my nutrition. I went back to making my grandmother's golden chai, which really helped my anxiety.
What is that, with turmeric and
with,
milk?
with turmeric, whatever flavor, whatever milk you like, but also actual whole Indian spices. And that's how she taught me to make it. But what was important about it is it taught me every single week. My doctors would ask, what are you eating, what are you doing? Because I tolerated the side effects at the time really well. And it became the blueprint and proved to myself how important nutrition was. And through my own, obviously, mind impacting the gut, mind impacting my emotions, I was able to tolerate that well. So it proved that to me, but then it was backed up by science. And I want to make a comment about the supplements. There's a varying amount of information about them. And that's why I think that, there are guidelines about how to choose a supplement, if that's the direction you're going in, because our American diet is not perfect, and we do have nutritional gaps. But food can also be a component of that. And I want to encourage using that along with other things. I want to make one other comment, which is the issue around sound. And you mentioned the bag of potato chips or something being opened is also used by the food industry to actually, this is done by PepsiCo. And their former CEO, Indra Nooyi, spoke about it in an interview where they changed the packaging of Sun chips to the crackly, crunchy sound because it was more appealing to that age group who was buying it. So it's these things around food, sound, taste, all of the things we're talking about today are used in good ways and not good ways. And that's not to say you shouldn't eat Sun chips, but it's just understanding where the research has gone.
Interesting. Dan, how has the research influenced your own diet?
Actually, Rachel, because I'm going to coattail off of yours.
Oh,
How do you know what I'm going to say?
have you rehearsed this without me?
Known her a long time.
Well, I'm going to surprise you. So a couple of different things. I like that Dr. Uma said that she's not a perfect eater. So what I love to eat are dark chocolate-covered almonds. And I like to tell myself, oh, dark chocolate's good for you, almonds are good for you, therefore it's totally fine. And the science says it's good for you. One of the other interesting things that I notice is that actually my mood influences when I eat that and how I eat it, in the sense that when I'm upset or angry, I will eat it with sort of without tasting it, kind of crunch it, swallow it, and sort of just get sort of the hit of it, while if I'm sort of feeling relaxed, I'll let it melt in my mouth and have a more luxurious, more decadent, actually enjoying it experience. So just as a little aside to personal eating. But the other thing that I've learned is the influence of distraction and also innate human laziness, and I mean this in the best possible way. So what this really refers to is I'm often someone who I do not stop really for meals. I'm sitting at my computer working. I'll have whatever I'm eating usually beside me, and often look down and say, did a poltergeist come into the room and just eat my lunch because it is gone? And I completely do not even know that I have consumed it. So this is in fact a really bad thing. It's bad because I didn't get any pleasure from it. I didn't know that I ate it, which maybe is a cognitive test of some sort. But also, it actually influences satiety. So perception of feeling full, feeling satisfied from having eaten something is not there nearly to the same extent, even though physiologically, and this goes back to the milkshake, example, I have consumed calories and so forth. So being aware, and I actually hate the term mindfulness, but it is truly sort of being in the moment with food, lets you savor the flavor, lets you experience it so much more, and you get so much more out of it, physiologically, psychologically, and so forth. And the other thing with respect to laziness is that, and this is kind of the all-you-can-eat buffet sort of situation of, especially if you're sitting near the all-you-can-eat buffet, you're much more likely to go up for seconds and thirds and so forth. But if you're in the restaurant very far from the buffet, you're less likely to go back. And that's also why if in your house you move the potato chips and the cookies somewhere where you have to actually get up and maybe go into a different room to get them, you are less likely to eat them than if they were right in front of you. And this is particularly also the situation where in the evening, people are sitting down, let's say in front of the television, and they have a bowl of something or other in front of them, and just like the work situation, it's disappeared and you haven't noticed it. And this also correlates with metabolism being slower. You've already just eaten a meal. You're not, you're going to go to bed soon. This is sort of a dangerous time to be eating. So again, this is when you want to move things far away and not be multitasking while eating at the same time.
All right. Did she say what you thought?
Yes.
All right.
So before I pick up on that, just like Dr. Uma was saying, in the neurology sector, there's updated literature in animal models looking at MS and the biomes, and there's a whole host of different neurologic disorders that's predicated on anti-inflammatory processes and gut biome related issues. So it's a growing body of literature, and a lot of them are being replicated. So it's an exciting time, scary time, but also exciting and opportunity-filled time to respond to the earlier statements of Dr. Uma. Now, to answer your question, I want to share a little bit of a story. So first things first, I am well versed in the literature, but I'm still not going to give up my street tacos. That's just not happening. I know what it's going to do to me when I have 6 of those at 3 a.m. You could ask my wife, but it's still happening. Okay, so do not feel like any of us.
She's nodding yes.
Right,
She's
exactly.
nodding yes.
Do not feel like any of us are here to thump on this, okay? Because as a service line director and working with clinical populations day in, day out, I know prescriptive lifestyle just does not work. It just does not deliver the way we want it to, because the ideas are great, ideas are bright. Implementation science is where it falls apart. Okay.
The knowledge action gap.
Exactly. So I'll give you the background story of how all this started for me and it'll kind of tie things together and answer that question. So 2006, Gordon Shepherd, a seminal figure in neurosciences, coined the term neurogastronomy. And basically, it is a science and the art of looking at why we eat what we eat and why we like what we eat and how we eat. And where I came in is to look at in the context of clinical translation, what that means for our patient population. So I went to Montreal in 2012 for a neuroscience conference, and at the time, my colleague, my friend at the university, Gina Mullen, remember this name, Gina Mullen, she helped me set up the reservation for the restaurant called Joe Beef Montreal. If you're a foodie, this is one of the best restaurants in the planet. This is where the chefs hang out. Okay, so we got there, and just because how things work out, they didn't have our reservation, so it got botched. And then we looked at each other and said, well, how often do we get to do this? Let's go ahead and wait. So we sat on the bar, and we got to actually sit down for dinner an hour and a half later. But because of that botched reservation, which was not Gina's fault, it was a computer issue. But because of that reservation botch, we sat late, ate late, and it was the best meal, yes. Because it was late, the chef of Joe Beef, Fred Morn, came out of the kitchen and started making the rounds. And he saw us, and we had lanyards and everything from the conference. Whoops, not on me. And he said, well, you're obviously not from around here, so why are you here? We said, we're here for a neuroscience conference. So he invites himself down, and he starts bringing out more wine and more food on the house. We weren't going to say no. And he says, I just read this book called Neurogastronomy. What are your thoughts on this? So after 3-4 bottles of wine later, he says, well, you get the neuroscientists and the clinicians together, and I'll get chefs and distillers and sommeliers. Let's have a meeting of the minds. Okay. And of course, we said, yes, let's do it, because we were drunk. And then we come back and thinking that it was a cool story, but we weren't really thinking about actually implementing this. It was a tall tale. And then I shared this with my colleague who was chair of neuroscience at the same institute. And he says, you know what, you got to meet Tim McClintock. He's a physiologist here. He actually worked 30 feet away from Gordon Shepherd, who coined the term neurogastronomy. Okay, so we do, and we contact Gordon, and he says, we'll go ahead and sponsor this. Let's go ahead and do this. Let's bring the minds together. So we got encouraged, started getting together, and unfortunately, around that exact same time, Gina Mullen, her breast cancer came back, and it metastasized. So we're sitting down, and this is all the background, and Gina's telling me, I'm taking her out to lunch, and she says, Dr. Hunt, when I got the diagnosis again, I didn't cry. I talked to my family, I didn't cry. But when I ordered my favorite cheeseburger and bit into it, and it tasted like metal, that's when I cried. And it really hit me hard. I felt very helpless. So we decided, you know what? We got scientists, clinicians, agricultural food technologists, chefs, sommeliers, distillers. Kentucky's known for bourbon. We got this meeting of the minds. We got to be able to do something about this. Okay. So we created what we call the Gina Mullen Challenge. So we created 2 teams. Each team comprised of a neuroscientist, clinician, agricultural food technologist, and a chef, teaching each other about their respective professional expertise, and then coming up with a dish. And then we competed to come up with the best dish, and Gina Mullen was our very first judge. So that continued, and this is our 10th year anniversary, and we extended that to hypertension, diabetes. We're doing one for dementia. So we continue to do that. So to answer your question, we have to be respectful of the human condition and the quality of life. And that's why we do what we do in healthcare provision.
Got it. I want to switch tracks just a little bit, and then in about 3 or 4 minutes, we'll take some questions. So think of your questions. Last summer, I wore a continuous glucose monitor for the whole summer. And I was very shocked by what I learned. I realized that the ups and downs in my glucose were like a lot more dramatic than I would have expected. And I made some changes. And I am not somebody who likes crazy diets. I take great pleasure in food. I consider myself a foodie. I don't want to have a very, very restrictive diet, but I did make a very simple change. I used to start my day with a big bowl of oatmeal, and I would put in berries or nuts or whatever, but like a lot of carbohydrate in there. And when I stopped doing that and kind of skipping breakfast until I got hungry, and then mostly eating sort of high fiber, like lots of greens and lots of protein through the day, and not eating really any refined carbohydrate until the end of the day, I noticed 2 things. My spikes were not the spike, my ups and downs were much easier. My A1C, which is a 3-month average of your blood sugar, actually came down, and I was not as hungry. I was like not thinking about food as much. And I was shocked by how profound the changes were by taking simple carbohydrates out of my day. To me, it was like kapow, food, mood. Reactions?
I'll start by saying that this has been shown, and I'm so excited for your N1 study, because I do think that, one of the things you struggle with in nutritional neuroscience is the fact that we use double-blind, placebo-controlled trials and large meta-analyses, but the truth is that this N of 1 is what is the most powerful, because everything else is providing averages. And what I will say is on any given day that someone says, you should eat this, I can also talk about studies that tell you not to eat the same thing. So this is what the public is faced with. So that's why I love what you're saying. But I also love the fact that it actually has been shown that things like oatmeal, which were previously perceived as just a healthy option, I'm not saying it's not healthy, it's how you eat it and what you eat it with and the time of day you eat it. And the type of oats, whether it's, a little bag that you add water or milk to and is loaded with brown sugar, is very different from steel-cut oats that you slow cook and you eat at a different time. Those are very powerful effects, and I think that those are the things that are the most powerful in terms of mood and food. Understanding whether someone wants to use a CGM or not, but also understanding what can you look at in your diet. So I use a very simple process with my patients. And this is because I learned it's very hard to get a long plan and lists of nutritional and recipes that I design for them, because it's too much. But I teach them the SAW method, which is SAW. Swap, add, and walk. Swap is take one thing that most of us will know, one thing that we should be eating less of. By the way, extra dark chocolate is very good for your brain. So you could continue that. But swapping out something that you're not happy with, it could be a beverage, it could be something you're adding to your tea or coffee, it could be, just an unhealthy habit, which have still stuck around since COVID. Add is adding in something that you might be liking, and it's very simple. With a lot of people, an easy thing to do is add in vegetables to anything that you're eating in every meal of your day. So spinach and peppers to your eggs, or adding arugula to your smoothie in the morning. There's a good one. You won't taste it as much. And adding in those servings to everything is an easy one. That doesn't mean you have to be plant forward, but those do provide fiber and nutrients and pretty low calorie. Or it could be protein. It could be that you've ignored healthy fats. Adding something in will help you. And walk is very generic for really, but it could be meditation, it could be adding walking to your life, exercising more, could be taking a yoga class. Anything that appeals to you. It could be Shinrin-yoku, which is forest bathing, spending time in nature. There's now an evolving field of medicine in Japan called forest medicine. And all of these things are really powerful because spending 10 minutes in direct sunlight, not through a window, gives you about 80% of your vitamin D for the day. Then put on your sunscreen or sunblock. But these simple things are people can start to add, like the simple change you made,
Yeah.
can add in a slow and steady way, not feel overwhelmed, and therefore sort of feel better over time. Because it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that our society is very used to kind of a quick fix, the supplement that fixes everything, the food or diet that fixes everything. And I think that's unfortunately what gets us in trouble.
Yeah, it's interesting they mentioned walk. I covered a study, and it must have been in 2023, and it found that when people took a walk after a meal, their blood sugar was cut by, the spike was cut by 60%. And the mechanism of it is very well understood. When you start activating your muscles, then your muscles need energy, right? So they're just like slurping, like literally slurping the glucose out of your food, right? And it's when we don't move our bodies that the glucose gets stored as like glycogen in the liver. And so just the simple thing of adding this 5-minute walk was helping people cut their spikes by 60%. And it's like, why doesn't every doctor tell every patient that, right?
It's true. Well,
Can I just say one thing connected to that too? So the idea of our food environment, I think, is really critical to this too. And the reason why we love the taste of sugar is because from an evolutionary perspective, it's the quickest, carbohydrates are the quickest form of usable energy that we have. Right. We need to consume them so we can survive to climb over hill and dale and find the next meal. Now the problem is our current food environment of abundance and very processed and so forth, and ease of access and so on, where we have access to all the carbohydrates that we're built to love, but we are not necessarily making the best of choices when we have them in front of us.
Absolutely. All right, questions? Right back here.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, my name is McKenna. I am an incoming second-year medical student, and I was really interested when you guys brought up the timing aspect of food. I know there's a lot of discourse about, is it good, is it bad to eat late at night, impacts on your metabolism, and same thing with breakfast, is it good or is it bad, things like that. So I was just wondering if you guys could comment on your research, maybe your personal experience and things you've noticed.
Okay.
Dr. Uma.
Okay. So this is interesting because there's actually, you talked about timing of food and the order of food. There is actually a body of evidence around that, starting, sort of ending with the carbohydrate and starting with a certain type of food like a protein first with, say, some greens. Now, with all of that, I still go back to personalized care and the individuals. One of my early cases in my clinic, a mom brought her teenage daughter who wanted to learn healthy eating. So she sat in on the consultation. I therefore discovered both of them, biologically related, had the exact opposite reaction to a healthy food. So it just reemphasizes how we need to understand that person. So people try intermittent fasting, they try, how they should eat their food, where they should. I do think eating late at night impacts sleep and impacts your metabolism. I do feel like if we can move after dinner, impacts our blood glucose levels, impacts, longer term insulin resistance, and is a healthier habit if you can do it. But then, you also have people who go on call and you having your meal at 2 a.m. So all of that needs to be taken into consideration. With intermittent fasting, we don't have as much data in mental health as yet, but anecdotally, patients will tell me they feel they have more energy when they try intermittent fasting under the guidance of a physician, and that they feel a little bit more alert, a little bit more focused. So I think that there's a lot of information. I don't think there's an exact rule around it, and I say that because everyone is different. You may be able to tolerate food in a different way, but I think the order of food is important, and something that can help people if they want to trial that for themselves is simple use of a CGM to see how their body reacts. Because paying attention to something Dr. Rachel said earlier, which is what we call body intelligence in nutritional psychiatry, is really paying attention to how that food makes you feel.
Yeah. To coattail on that, so many of us, including those who are in direct healthcare provision, are not as well versed as we ought to be in population health statistics. So as the spread occurs, that diversity of how things work in the individual it's very, very overwhelming in terms of the difference. We are very similar, but that individual difference is huge at the margins, especially at the margins. And for clinical provision, at the margins is where we care for the patients, because those are the ones who are coming in with illnesses and deficits, et cetera, et cetera. So to coattail on what both of my colleagues were talking about is that at the margins, it could literally work and be slightly above a certain threshold, or not work because it didn't meet that threshold for that one person. So it's very important that we are respectful of that. Yeah.
All right, the question way in the back here.
Thank you so much. I've been taking notes furiously. My name is Janine Versi. I run a women's health company called Electra Health, focused on helping women navigate the perimenopause to postmenopause milieu with evidence-based medicine, as well as a lot of support and education. And my question is, because we hear this all the time from our patients, what can they do to help to counteract what they often call menobelly and just what they perceive to be a slowing of the metabolism? And what should we help them to stay educated around? Because there is so much out there. And so I wonder, Dr. Uma or any of the others, if you have a specific takeaway I can bring back to our clinical and frontline teams, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think there's a huge emerging body of more research around menopause, and I think it's exciting because it's really addressing what women have experienced, which is, here's an SSRI and just get over it kind of thing. And I think it's important to acknowledge the symptoms that are really feeling. Simple things like the addition of hydration, fiber, and anti-inflammatory foods to someone who's peri or menopausal can be very powerful. Simple things like adding spices and herbs and going back to a whole foods diet, using that SAW method, adding back foods, because they develop cravings, right? All the hormonal fluctuations, one of the things that happens in the gut microbiome is those trillions of microbes actually function to do many things. One of them is vitamin and hormone production. So understanding your gut health, considering, eating more probiotics, fermented food. A study in Stanford a few years ago looked at the addition of fermented foods, and what it surprisingly showed was the addition of fermented foods lowered inflammation. So something like that can be very powerful, just adding in to what they're eating, as well as what I call clean up your eating, which is just improve those habits which are less healthy. Rather than feeling guilty and bad about our food, because we know from science that we feel terrible about what we're eating. If it is that milkshake, it actually gets absorbed differently, we feel differently. This has been shown in research. So those simple things are usually where I have them start. And I try to avoid the use of an SSRI medication unless they're severely depressed. There might be a need for it if they are very severely depressed, and they might need it for a short time. But those are one of the ways in which I get them started.
And if I could just add to that, I think one of the pieces is also education. So understanding that physiologically the metabolism is changing and slowing down naturally, and that one way to potentially offset that is by increasing activity, sort of understanding that relationship, which also may be different for different people, but kind of having that more holistic picture of understanding your body and how you can offset some of the changes that are just taking place because of facts of life.
We have time for one more question, or maybe two.
I'm sorry. For probiotics, should you be taking it every day? And are the shelf varieties okay to take, like Nature Made? Is that a good probiotic? And just one more thing. Sure. I have. Isn't the real criminal, nefarious criminal of food saturated fat? And should you eliminate butter from your life?
Oh, wow.
Let me reverse engineer those questions. There was a very, very important study published right at the beginning of COVID, and it was the most cited article by the JACC, which is the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. I may get that wrong, but the study was by a researcher called Astrup, A-S-T-R-U-P. I know there's a cardiologist in the room because I spoke to him yesterday. Mm-hmm. But it did revisit the science around saturated fats. And I think that what led me to think about it in the research is that I'm not saying that, what's touted on social media, which is the ketogenic diet will help you eat, lose weight, so eat eggs, butter, and cheese. I'm not saying that's the way, because there's a different form of use of that diet called ketogenic therapies, and we use that in mental health. So it caused me to revisit that. I don't think butter is bad uniformly. One example, Chef Julia Childs, who's my food hero, ate butter until the healthy age of 94 and was slim, not overweight, was complete, and she drank martinis. So it goes back to the end of one, and happiness when you're eating your food. I think use of a small amount of butter in your food for the flavor. In Indian cuisine, we use ghee, which is basically purified, clarified butter. That is a little bit, not necessarily a huge amount, is completely okay. You should, of course, be guided by your doctor, your cardiologist, if you have those issues. But I am not a believer that we should exclude beef from our diet unless you're vegetarian. But if you are eating it and you can, and it's within, you can afford grass-fed beef, that's a better option for you. But you don't have to eat it every day. It's always in moderation. So I may have a different opinion from some of my cardiology colleagues, but I have looked at it from many different ways, and I feel that offering people a more balanced approach is better because more people consume beef than not, and that's been shown in the US. Going back to the probiotics, so I don't comment specifically on brands because I don't research them, but I have some guidances on probiotics. If it makes you feel good and you have looked up, so there are certain entities like the Consumer Reports that will guide you on better brands to use. I usually suggest people use that. It's a subscription and you can read about different supplements there. But if you're taking a probiotic and you're feeling good, continue to take it because the moment you stop taking it, it reverses the changes in your gut if you're using a supplemental form. But if you're doing it through food, just doing it consistently really does help. But be guided by your body. If you're upset, not feeling good, you might need to change, find a different strain, look for a different brand.
We are all out of time. You've been a wonderful audience and a wonderful panel. Thank you.